Greetings, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to my talk, and a special thank you to the conference organizers for allowing me to talk with you today. My name is Curtis Williams. I'm from Texas A&M University in Commerce, which is near Dallas in the United States. And I'm here today to talk to you about white dwarf rotation in the era of big data. So this is a little bit about where the field of white dwarf rotation stands right now, why it's interesting to us, and a look forward into a lot of the data that will be coming in the next few years. I don't need to tell you that angular momentum transport is an extraordinarily difficult problem to understand in evolved stars. And while there are some astroseismological observations that can constrain the evolution of the core angular momentum in these stars, the resulting models just don't match the white dwarf rotational distribution extraordinarily well. For example, on the right is a plot of the observed white dwarf rotational periods in the red histogram, along with some astroseismically informed models as the stars, and you just notice there's not a lot of overlap between those. White dwarf rotation is extraordinarily difficult to measure. V sin I measurements do not give us interesting limits because white dwarf atmospheres prevent precision measurements of rotational velocities. Observations of pulsating white dwarfs have been able to give us some rotational periods, and they tended to range from several hours to several days in length, but that's limited to white dwarfs of specific effective temperatures, which is a very narrow age range. Recently, photometric variations have become a popular way of looking for white dwarf rotation, and several short period rotators have been found, with rotational periods shorter than 1 hour. But an open question is how many of these rapidly rotating white dwarfs are the result of single star evolution, and how many are the result of something such as accretion spin-up or white dwarf mergers. So there soon will be an abundance of white dwarf rotation periods. Most of these will be derived from photometric variability. Just as an example, Ilaria Caiazzo and her collaborators spoke about their upcoming work on ZTF rotational periods for 41 white dwarfs. And any time domain survey such as K2, TESS, the Catalina Sky Survey, the Zwicky Transient Factory, and any other such survey, these are ripe to be mined for searches of white dwarf rotational signals, and there are several groups in the process of doing so. The main issue that we will have in understanding the rotational period distribution will be follow-up and proper interpretation. Most of the photometric variability that is being touted as signals of rotation is assumed to come from magnetic spots. There are many uncertainties regarding magnetic spots on white dwarfs. For example, there are many who tout that magnetic fields in white dwarfs come from white dwarf mergers. And therefore, if we are using magnetic spots to determine rotational periods, we're actually measuring the resulting rotational distribution from merger remnants and not that of single star evolution. Magnetic fields themselves can impact the angular momentum evolution of a post-AGB star and the resulting white dwarf. So that leaves the question open. Would unspotted stars, would white dwarfs with low to no magnetic fields, follow the same rotational distribution? There are other sources of variability, faint companions, eclipses, metal spots, weak accretion, and so forth, that with proper follow-up, it's possible to determine if those are sources of variability. So let me end on this note, that we'll need to be cautious, but there will be a flood of white dwarf rotational periods coming out in the coming years and decades. And that with these, we can study rotational distributions as a function of white dwarf mass, which presumably will then tell us something about the progenitor star mass, and what effect that had on AGB evolution. So keep this in mind as you go forward, and any comments or constraints in helping me to understand the white dwarf rotation distributions would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for your time.